company who emit less than standard gets surplus credit as financial incentives. And it also incentivizes company to reduce emission more than required and sell them to the market if their emission reduction cost is lower. And it actually gave flexibility to the companies participating in the market, whether they want to reduce emission themselves or buy from the market.
Hello, everyone. My name is Michael Davidson, Assistant Professor, School of Global Policy and Strategy, and the Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering Department at University of California, San Diego, where I direct the Power Transformation Lab. And I'm really pleased to introduce our guests for today's interviews on exploring China's carbon emissions trading system. Briefly, as their full bios are on the website, Max Song is the CEO of Carbonbase, which is Asia's first digital native carbon registry. And then Xiaolu Zhao, or Lulu, is Senior Director of Climate at the Environmental Defense Fund, where she manages projects to support China in building its national carbon market. So welcome, Max and Lulu.
Thank you.
Lulu, I'm gonna start with you, since I imagine a lot of our listeners, viewers probably aren't super familiar about carbon trading. So can you just let us know what is it and how is it different than carbon taxes or subsidies of renewable energy, and what's the global landscape look like for carbon trading?
Sure. Basically, it is to build an artificial market to trade carbon emissions. So, for example, a company who emit less than standard gets surplus credit as financial incentives. And it also incentivizes company to reduce emission more than required and sell them to the market if their emission reduction cost is lower. And it actually gave flexibility to the companies participating in the market, whether they want to reduce emission themselves or buy from the market. So overall, as a society, it reduced the society's abatement cost. And also by doing so, the market gave enterprises a further expectation of the price of carbon and help them make smart decisions for their further investments. So through this market, carbon emission basically give the price to a carbon. So that's the same as a carbon tax. However, carbon market it's actually aims at reduce social cost of carbon emission, while carbon tax secure government funding from taxing on carbon emission. So basically, internationally, carbon market is a general way to reduce carbon market around the world. 18% of global carbon emission are covered by a form of emission trading system, and that generated over 33 billion US dollars through auction proceed as a function of carbon market, and which is 16% more than last year. So it's a huge market that can also invest on more emission reduction technology and product in the future.
Yeah, thanks. Lulu, what was that percentage again? What percentage of global emissions are covered?
18,
18%. Okay, well, that's a sizable fraction there. So I mean, maybe I'll turn to Max. Is that significant for meeting global climate goals? We say 18% of total emissions are covered under these systems. Are they making a dent?
Yeah, so just to add more to Lulu's great sharing, I think, the conceptual framework of carbon trading is actually separated into sort of two different types of carbon credit markets, right? There's something called a compliance market and then a voluntary market. So in the view of the compliance market, the government forces a certain subset of companies inside their jurisdiction to have to report their emissions and also have to purchase these permits, right, for the permission to emit from the government, and it creates a sort of government income while also socializing a sort of compliance cost on the price of carbon. And China, being 27% of global emissions, has a very huge footprint to cover. And as Lou said, the first step of the Chinese compliance market is really the power sector, which is a pretty substantial portion of the China's total emissions. However, from a trading perspective, or from like a sort of participation perspective, at the very beginning of these schemes, the government usually actually gives the permits at a discount to the company so that they don't have to spend their entire balance sheet basically participating. So I think what we're seeing right now is actually that many Chinese companies that are underneath this regulation are just beginning to understand what it means to start paying for carbon every year as a transition process. This is in contrast to what's happening in Europe, which has had a compliance market for nearly 20 years and is now at a point where both the dollar value of the credits as well as the company expenditure have gone to quite considerable amounts of sums of money. And then the last thing I would say is, parallel to this, also China has reactivated its CCER market, which is the voluntary carbon market. And that's really interesting because the voluntary market actually gives individuals and companies a chance to create, right, impact, create negative emission outcomes, and actually be financially rewarded for that. So there's a sort of separate system to actually empower and encourage people to actually decarbonize and actually potentially make money from that effort as well.
Yeah. So maybe you could briefly just walk me through if the permits are auctioned off versus if the permits are given away for free. How do we understand those two outcomes in terms of their impact on the climate?
Well, the given for free is a gradual ease-in process, right? So the idea is that you don't want to cook the industries too quickly because they would then struggle to make ends meet, right, if they have to sort of internalize a very strong cost of carbon. But the eventual goal, this is my understanding, I'd love to hear Louis thinking, is that there needs to be a strong kind of horizontal price of carbon across different sectors, right? Steel sector, power sector, cement sector, and the balance of how difficult it is to abate the emissions in each of these sectors actually gets transferred to each other through this kind of instrument, meaning that if it's really expensive to abate carbon emissions in steel and it's a little bit easier in power generation, then the power generator guys would sort of enact that activity first, save on their permits, and actually sell those permits at a slight premium to the steel industry. And that way, there's a sort of gradual harmonization across different sectors.
Yeah, I think we can see that sort of as a transitional, that eventually the goal of any system would be to auction off the permits in order to generate revenues and to potentially spend those revenues on other climate projects. Walk me through the sort of generally, what are the challenges that governments face in putting a price on carbon? I mean, I'll ask Lulu and Max this because I feel like this is a big question, right? We've had this question in many contexts, including the United States. What are some of the key challenges that you both have observed?
Okay, I'll start. For carbon market in China, the idea started in 2011. So it's quite early. It's one of the first try the government want to control climate emission. So back then, there's no regulation, no law, no nothing that we can piggyback. Like in the United States, you have Clean Air Act as a foundation that all of the policy built upon it. And also one other challenge is you have to have an enterprise level MRV system, which is a monitoring, reporting, and verification system to let the government know, to let enterprises know, to let everybody know where are the emissions and what is the annual emission from a specific sector and company. And also you need to have a very established set or a group of government officials and service providers to understand what is actually a carbon market, what is trading, to make it happen. So the infrastructure building is really important, and it's a tremendous work to build before the market even started the first trading. And but luckily, or more importantly, China is a huge economy. It's emit almost a third of the global emissions. So right now, with only power sector, it's already 5.5 billion tons of CO2 per year. So the scale make it really difficult to launch a market in the beginning.
Yeah, Max,
And
thoughts on your end about the
there's pieces there. There's one of them is actually from a policy setting piece, right? So does a country have enough political muscle to actually start enforcing the price of carbon, right? So, I wrote a thesis when I was at Schwarzman on US, China, and green finance public policy, looking at the comparative political makeup of China and the US. And, as of today, Europe has passed a national, so I guess a sort of regional compliance market law. China has put one in place. The US, as of today, does not have a national one. There's sort of two subnational systems, one in California, one in northern New England. And it comes back to political will. It's actually quite disruptive to business to start accounting for carbon at an institutional scale. And so there's pushback from policy and lobbying to prevent that from happening as much as possible. So I think that's one dimension, right, of how strong the enforcement angle is. In China's case, the emission trading scheme is administered under the Ministry of Economy, the Ministry of Environment, MEE, but that has less penalty setting ability than other sectors in China, for example, the NDRC or other sort of powerful bodies. So I think that is one dimension. The other dimension is data, right? So as a former data scientist, there's a lot of scrutiny around the reporting that comes in from the company side. And unless you have really good reach into these companies, the incentives of the companies actually is to underreport their emissions, because that way they have to buy less permits. And so in the very beginning of the China emission trading scheme, there was actually, I think, one documented case where a factory was severely underreporting their emissions as a way to get away with their current economic setup. So I think both of these dimensions, the ability to enforce and then also the ability to track, are going to play a long role in actually making sure that this scheme actually meets its targets. But something I think on the positive lighting side is that, China has pretty robust like IoT infrastructure, right? There's a lot of companies that are building sensors and physical hardware and machines. So our thinking is actually that eventually the innovation, right, the ability to sort of sense and record and touch a lot of industrial processes, especially those state-owned enterprises, are going to actually help the regulators in China see more clearly into its supply chain and actually start being able to monitor the emissions from different factories and power utilities.
Yeah, we're bleeding into some of the interesting challenges and features of the China system. So I say we just kind of dive right in. I think to sort of set the scene, maybe Lulu, you could give us a little flavor for how, what are China's overall commitments on climate change, and maybe how they align with global climate goals. And then we can get into where does the carbon emissions trading system or ETS kind of fit into that?
Sure. So China has this overall goal to peak its emission before 2030 and reach carbon neutrality by 2060. So that's what we call acronym is 3060 goal. So globally, we want to achieve 1.5 degree goal with achieving carbon neutrality by 2050. So it seems China is a little bit slower than the global average. However, there are only 30 years for China to reach neutrality from peaking. So averagely speaking, it's 50 years from the other countries. So that's a lot of challenges, because China still is developing its economy. So you're facing economy developing challenges, traditional pollution challenge, and climate pollution challenge all at the same time. Like, for example, let's take India as another example. India is expected to peak in the 2040s and reach neutrality in 2070s. So if China can pave its own way to achieve neutrality by 2060s, then it's going to be a hope or a pathway for other developing countries to consider. And carbon markets right now is the only climate policy with peace in China that has enforcement power. Basically, it can penalize companies and service providers if they don't do by the law. So it covers 40% of China's emission right now, but it will cover close to 80% of China's primary energy emission by expanding its coverage to all of the 8 sectors. It's going to be cement, aluminum, iron, steel, petrochemical, chemical, and aviation, and paper and pulp.
Great. Yeah. So, we heard about the 3060 goals. Those are China's kind of top line climate commitments. I guess the question is, how does the ETS sort of fit into that, right? How important is the ETS, say, for the 2030 goal versus the 2060 goal? And is China, where is China in terms of getting on track for both of those goals? I'm curious, maybe Lulu, just to follow up to that, and then I'll also go to Max and get your thoughts.
Mm-hmm. That, that's a really nice question because Chinese carbon markets start without a hard cap, unlike a lot of the other carbon market in the world, like EU ETS or California REG we mentioned before. Um, it's more of a performance standard, tradable performance standard in a way. So, which means the total emission of China's carbon market might increase to a certain level. However, that indeed provided flexibility for the companies or a, a willingness from the private sector to participate as a baby market, because when you have a way too huge pushback fight from the private sector, it's going to be very difficult for the government to hold the same political will. But of course, it's right now a lot of the studies and think tanks are thinking to give a absolute cap to the national carbon market in the future, and especially when China is very close to peak its emission, it's easier to give a more stringent allocation goal and target. And one challenge, actually, I need to point out, I don't really have an answer, is China's power sector. And Michael, you're a really expert in this. It's very difficult, or it's impossible for the power provider to pass the cost to the end user. For example, in EU and California REGI, it's easy to auction out 100% because power provider can pass on the cost, while in China it's not the same case. So the government, to build a national carbon market and to achieve its emission goal, need to overcome a lot of other challenges, like how to achieve a synergy between climate goal and between power and between conventional pollution reduction goal. Sorry, I don't have a straight
Yep.
answer.
Yeah, no, I think that helps to frame exactly kind of where the stage of evolution is in China's ETS, from a not quite at a hard cap and ceiling with all of these auctions that we know and love in the EU context. I guess maybe we could also take a step back and just say, so maybe Max, you could chime in a little bit here as well, like in terms of China's sort of trajectory towards the 2030 goals and then 2060. Do we see it on track? Or is it not on track, or why? And then is the ETS going to fill some important gap in one or both of those kind of targets?
Yeah, I think that the challenge of the ETS really is actually to transition from giving large sums of its credits out for free to actually having like a very strong auction system, right? And so in the European case, I think more than 80 or 90% of the permits now are being auctioned. The exact numbers I don't have in front of me, but I think it sort of has reached a very substantial payment layer. And this actually brings back a lot of money back to the government, which is able to be used for policy, particular subsidies in particular in sectors. Versus I think right now China is still very much allocating large portions of the credits out as a way to teach the companies that there is kind of a trading market ahead of this. If I can drill into a smaller piece, so 5% of the Chinese compliance market is actually being made available to use the CCERs, the China Certified Emission Reduction credits. And these credits are a way for companies actually to generate outcomes of decarbonization. And one thing I'm really excited about is actually using the CCRs as a way to bring in many more entrepreneurs and private sector participants to come in and create the decarbonization technology necessary to actually achieve these goals. Because the compliance market, in some ways, it sort of it passes a lot of cost to the producers of various goods and services, and unless they're able to pass it to the end consumer, those companies may go bankrupt, right? They may just, been unable to handle that cost, versus having a sort of profit incentive, I've found actually motivates a lot more of the participants we've talked to in China, and gets them to want to act much more willingly. And I think there is a movement towards creation of carbon removal technology. So if you look at what's happening in Switzerland and also in Canada, there are now companies that build industrial scale carbon removal activities, direct air capture systems that can capture CO2 at a pretty high premium. I think right now the cost is about $200 per ton. But with R&D and sort of marketization, maybe that cost comes down to 30, 50 US dollars. And that becomes a very meaningful way to generate carbon reduction outcomes. China being the global supply chain of the world, being the factory of the world, has the ability to create these machines and these services, I think, at a much lower cost than either Switzerland or Canada. And so I think that's a way where the industrial might of China can be coupled to the global, decarbonization cost that we're trying to set through the policy framework.
No, that's a really fascinating point. I just wanted to confirm, you see that there's a linkage potentially between the CCR offset market and some of these other technologies that are not directly incorporated under the carbon emissions trading system, and are maybe more novel and require a little bit of extra sort of bonus in terms of this carbon permit sales. Is that right?
Definitely. And just one more thing to highlight there, I think it's like kind of the two sides of the policy, right? There's the stick and the carrot. So the stick is the compliance market. Is if you don't comply, there's a fine, and also, you might be put out of business, or there's many other penalties. The carrot actually is the CCR market, right? And it's other kind of like international, comparables. Because if you do R&D, right, let's say you make a new material science innovation that allows your battery interface to be much more efficient, or your solar voltaics to be more efficient, those things actually have substantial carbon outcome reduction outcomes. And through the CCR or other volunteer carbon schemes, you can actually get paid for that innovation, right? And so I think that drives a lot of innovation in the private sector level that actually leads to the ultimate decarbonization goals that we need to have. I think there's a really good example of this happening in the private sector in the US right now with something called the Frontier Fund. So that's Google, Microsoft, McKinsey, and Stripe actually putting together $1 billion and saying, we're going to spend this $1 billion buying high quality carbon removal outcomes. And that spurred, a few hundred companies to come into existence because of the goal of that prize. And I think, they call it AMC, an advanced market commitment. And that's a corporate AMC, right? It's made by the companies. So my thinking is, China's really good at industrial policy. If China sets something like a sovereign AMC, or even a subnational, like a local government AMC, that actually will create and stimulate a lot of the market participants in China to start focusing their creative outputs towards decarbonization technology.
Yeah, fascinating. So I wanted to go back to something, Lulu, that you mentioned about there, not being a hard cap. This is a tradable performance standard. I think maybe could you, I guess, summarize or help us to understand, how do we interpret sort of the price in China's carbon market, given that there is no cap, that it's relative to a tradable performance standard? Since I imagine we'll have one viewer that just like refreshes the EU ETS price like every 5 minutes, and so they're very familiar with how the price of that's formed. Maybe give us some context of what the price in the China context means, and then also like what are the prospects for putting in place a hard cap? Like, is that even on the table, and under what time frame?
Wow. It's indeed a very complicated issue, and I can provide some of my thinking around it. For example, currently, China carbon market is 100% of free allocation, but it doesn't mean every ton is free allocated, or the company doesn't need to pay anything. So the price of carbon market right now is around $12. When it started, the carbon market began, it's 48 RMB, so it's around $7. So we see the price significantly increased within 2 years of time. That reflect the expectation of the carbon market participants. And the price actually means if you, as a company, doesn't comply, you need to pay that as a price of non-compliance. Or not really, it's not really a price, but it's basically the cost of not having enough emission allowance in your account. And also it's a indication for the companies to make long-term decision making. If you are continuously having this shortage in your in your carbon account, you will need to pay that certain amount of level for them to make decision whether I want to invest in an abatement choice, or I want to go bankrupt, out of business, or this is a investment for me to do in the future. So that's what it's about. For the cap, it's more complicated because, as what Max just said, China's carbon market will include multiple sectors. So setting a cap in different sectors means you need to achieve a balance of which sector will have more, or which sector you're expecting there to reduce more, or which sector have more feasible technologies that to reduce emission as a low cost. So it's definitely going to be a fight, and sometimes it's not even a scientific, or it's more of a political decision rather than a scientific discussion. So that's also why we see CBAM is formulating in the EU and a lot of other countries. For example, UK is also doing their own type of border adjustment tax, because EU want to avoid emission leakage. And also that's as a way that EU want to phase out free allocation for industry sectors like iron and steel. So they need other importers to have the same level of price of carbon. So that's the current status. And China is, the experts are studying the possibility or the total absolute cap right now, but it still need time to introduce that absolute cap to the economy, especially the total economic trajectory is really uncertain. So the reason China's carbon market launched during the pandemic. So at that time, there's no certainty whether we're going to see more emission because the economy will recover as well, or we see less emission because the economy is not going to recover as we think. So the uncertainty brings the fact that we're using this trade performance from the beginning.
Hmm. Yeah, so I guess I would no, that's fascinating. I would be remiss if I didn't ask the question that many people are asking these days, which is China's 2035 NDC going to include an absolute cap on emissions? As we know, their current 2030 NDC just has peak carbon emissions without specifying the level at which they peak, which has, of course, invited a lot of scrutiny and criticism from the international community. There's been talk in a lot of different fora in China about this and whether or not the 2035 NDC, which is set to be announced next year, could include a absolute cap on emissions as opposed to the relative measures. I know you guys don't have a crystal ball, but I'm curious where you think this might land, or what would be your kind of way to analyze how China might go about setting that.
I cannot answer for the government, but indeed there's a lot of discussion recently about the absolute cap, not only for government, but for carbon market, but also for the entire economy. And also right now it's about the time for China to set up its 15th five-year plan. So the renewal of new NDC aiming by 2035, it's right now it's need to coordinate with the setting of 15th five-year plan. And also we see this trend for China to shift its policy making from dual energy goal to dual carbon goal, which means in the past China reduce or its goal for the government is to reduce both energy consumption and energy intensity to reduce carbon emission, total carbon emission, and total and carbon intensity. So that's the shift. It's very clear. So it's definitely going to happen at some time. China has the absolutely all economy carbon cap, but it's just still not sure whether we can achieve that within a year's time, though.
Hmm. Great. Max, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think, it's very difficult to predict the policy making. I do think that the way that this policy has been formulated in China has been designed to leave some flexibility for policymakers to sort of choose their own path, right, depending on the current state of the economy. And I think that flexibility, I don't think that they're going to surrender that flexibility anytime soon, even, despite, international criticism. I think one of the key challenges people have to understand about China is that China's emissions actually are reflective not only of its own consumption, but also the global consumption, right? China as a major export, driven economy, like a lot of the emissions that are embodied in US consumption, European consumption originate in China, and China has sort of had to bear the brunt of that burden. So I think in some ways the flip side is how does China be able to communicate this cost of carbon production to its end consumers, right? The people sitting in other parts of the world, and so that there's willingness at their level to accept that their toys or their furniture or their cars have a higher price of supply because there's now an effort to decarbonize. And I think that is critical for China to reach its own goals. Um, you know, Otherwise, I think it's going to be a very unbalanced kind of pressure of where the financial burden of decarbonization sits in.
Yeah, so I mean, I think this is really fascinating. So I mean, when maybe we kind of uh, piece apart like this interaction with the global system and how different countries are responding, and then we'll close and maybe you each of you have, if you have some like sort of parting thoughts on where you think China's ETS is going to go, say in the next 5 years and then beyond. But first, I mean, I think the question, I mean, I feel like Lulu, you probably mentioned CBAM, and I probably will define the acronym for everyone. Is that a big impetus for China to accelerate its ETS development? Or how is the international efforts around putting carbon pricing and then putting on these border adjustment tariffs influencing China's own internal development of the carbon market?
CBAM is acronym for Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. It's technically not a tax in the world, but it's sort of a border adjustment tax. For example, CBAM, it's only ask for the buyer within EU to pay for the price difference if they're going to buy something from China. So, which means it has several factors to influence the price is going to be paid. One is the price difference between China's carbon market price and EU carbon market price. Right now, it's extremely huge, and the other is the total amount of export. So in China, for example, iron steel is the sector that's going to be heavily influenced, but however, it's still only 4% of the total. So CBAM is definitely a factor, but not that huge to influence the living or death of that sector in China, because majority of the production is still consumed domestically within China. But it's definitely a push or a clear signal that global trend is going to be this, and China will need to have some of the price in its domestic product. And also, for example, right now everything in China, in the past, everything in China is controlled in the name of energy. Like we have energy tax, but we don't have carbon tax. Do we need to shift that mindset in the future? Is also a question, or a capacity building, or awareness raising within the government, or the policymakers, not only for Ministry of Ecology and Environment, but more for broader policymaker, including the Ministry of Finance, NRDC, Ministry of Transportation, everybody. And also, not only CBAM is the pressure, there's also a lot of other policy might have influence for China to accelerate climate-related policy, for example, Battery Act, Critical Mineral Act. That's all asked for China to have a clear idea of how much is emit, what is trajectory of emission, and how to reduce its carbon emission. As ETS is the only policy with peaks right now, and the highest level of regulation of climate is the management decree of carbon market. So that's what we've been seeing, and that's hopefully it's going to be we have a bright future of carbon market.
So Max, similar question, but I wanted to pull on this thread just one if you indulge me just a little bit. So the CBAM sort of is a response when countries don't agree on carbon pricing or climate emissions trading or whatever it is, and so then they set up these walls at the border and say, well, your climate policy is not as ambitious as mine, so I'm going to put some kind of tariff or maybe a tax, however you call it, on it. I can recall when China was initially coming out with its pilots of ETS in 2010, there was a whole wave of delegates from EU and then another whole wave of delegates from California. And there was lots of talk about China's going to link all of their ETS with all these other global systems, which would, of course, obviate the need for having a CBAM. Is that in the cards now, or are we basically beyond the linkage conversation anymore?
I think that there's some language in the Article 6.4 kind of like international country to country level carbon trading that still has aspirations to be realized. I think these climate change conferences that happen once a year, that's kind of a key negotiation point for the framework. What we see right now is actually there's much more bilateral agreements happening between two individual countries about particular transfer of either compliance or other types of credits for those countries. I think the CBAM implementation actually is much more of a policy realistic goal, right? Which is the European Union says we have the ability to regulate inside our territory, and so we want to use that as a springboard to start controlling how we interact with other countries. And there's a bit of similarity with the GDPR rules as well, right? And in some ways, I think from a global climate change policy agenda setting perspective, CBAM actually is a really positive step forward because it starts putting on the table regulation that governs inter-country trade as well. And I think the high price of the European ETS has actually had a beneficial impact to both the psychology and the health of the European industries, because the companies that survive in that environment are naturally much more carbon aware and much more carbon efficient. And through this enforcement of having other importers pay the European ETS price for carbon, even if the sort of sending country doesn't have their policy in place fully, they start being exposed to what a 80 or 75 euro per ton impact looks like. So that's my current feeling. And if I can just draw the conversation a little bit back to the volunteer market for just conclusion remarks, I think the volunteer market already today is a global market, right? And so unlike the policy formation challenges of the compliance market, the volunteer market today has private companies start accepting much higher prices of carbon in their procurement decisions, right? Microsoft's buying credits at anywhere from $50 to $250 a ton. That's a very sizable cost of carbon. And I think the international nature of the volunteer market also is, as of today, kind of a precursor, I think, to more compliance conversations. So the CCR, which China turned on recently, has to be harmonized with other volunteer standards like Vera, like Gold Standard, and in California, the American Carbon Registry and the Climate Action Reserve methodologies as well. And from where we are working on trying to construct new standards at the international level that has a piece facing China, piece facing the rest of the world, we see ourselves kind of at the intersection of this international carbon price conversation, right? And just to reiterate the last point I made, I think that the stick is powerful to make people aware, but the carrot is where we need for innovation. We need to have ways for people to make new types of income, new types of industries because of the need to decarbonize. That's really where I think a lot more powerful innovation will come from. And I think the EV sector actually represents the first kind of powerful breakthrough of creating trillion-dollar companies, right, based on a product that actually inherently is more energy efficient than its precursor. And then seeing how that plays out across other physical and industrial sectors, I think gives me a lot of hope that this is where, you know, the global consumer class is going to start producing and internalizing higher cost of carbon inside their daily lives.
Excellent, Max. Lulu, concluding thoughts. Where are we headed? What should we be watching out for? Or what are you most excited?
My most excitement of Chinese carbon market is the expansion of coverage sectors. Because right now we only have power sector. And it cannot pass the cost to the end user. While in cement, aluminum, iron, steel, or even some product of petrochemical, we can do so. And also, it's diversified emission abatement choice. So we might have more liquidity in the secondary market, which is the foundation for us to bring in investment or institutional investors into the market and to produce, for example, see if we can introduce future as a trade product. Right now, because carbon market in China only allowed covered companies to trade and only have spot market. So it's kind of boring right now, but in the future we'll see more diversified trading activities, and hopefully we'll have auction introduced as soon as possible, because EU has this almost 6 billion euros collected through the carbon market, which is a huge amount of money. If we have the money to reinvest in the emission reduction area, we might have something more through R&D, and we have more options to invest into probably like negative technologies in the future, like what Max just mentioned.
Yeah, excellent. Well, thank you both so much for sharing your thoughts and insights with us today. I heard a lot of challenges, but also a lot of opportunities. So you both have your work cut out for you. I'd also like to thank the National Committee staff members behind the scenes who have made today's interviews possible. We also hope that those who have tuned in today found the interview both interesting and informative, and that you'll join us for future National Committee programming. All right, thank you all again.